Here with Jesh de Rox, who is one of my favorite people, I would say. Fascinating person. I think you're gonna like what he has to say. I just want to start with a brief sort of intro of who I am and who Jesh is, and then we'll get into the conversation. So for me, I started my career in AI. Actually, I was an AI researcher in the '90s, so in ancient times, and and then I went into tech law, and I wanted to work in kind of technology policy. So I worked in Silicon Valley for a couple of decades doing that, and then I went and did this whole kind of like side journey through yoga and consciousness, and I lived in India and studied Vedic philosophy, and came back and got a master's in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And so now I'm kind of a philosopher of technology is how I think of myself. And yeah, so I'm working as an AI lawyer still part time. I work at Google right now, but also I'm writing a book about what it means to be human in the age of AI. So I'm thinking a lot about this stuff, and then that's why I think Josh and I are good sort of discussion partners, because we have, I think, unique perspectives on technology and AI. So I'm excited to get into that. So, but yeah, the last thing I'll say is for myself is a lot of what I'm focused on is examining the ideologies that are driving technology innovation, because I think it's important. That creates, that kind of shapes and crafts technology and AI. So I have a lot of thoughts about that. Maybe we'll get into it today, but anyways, that's who I am, where I'm coming from, and I'll hand it over to Jesh to kind of give an intro, because I think he can do it better than I can.
Well, first, I would like to say you're not one of my favorite people. You're my favorite
Oh,
person.
geez, okay, well.
So this is a little awkward for me now.
I'll reconsider my evaluation.
Okay. Can negotiate. My name is Jesh. I, to be honest, never would have conceived myself to be in tech. I had a very unusual upbringing that would take a long time to tell all of it, but the short version is I was quite isolated as a child. And as a result of that, I became obsessed with trying to understand how to make a friend. A lot of the friendship kind of skills that we learn are not really taught to us. They're absorbed. It's a very old system in the brain that makes the bonding process happen. It's quite a mysterious thing too. If you try to describe why you're friends with a certain person, it would not be an easy thing to do. And if you try to describe why you love one person and how that's different than the way you love another person, that's a very difficult thing to describe. So these are very old systems in the brain. They're separate systems from thought, and thought is, of course, how we conceive of everything. And as a result of that, a lot of that stuff is in the autonomic processes, and difficult to talk about, difficult to teach, and yet still at the underpinning of almost everything that we find valuable and of meaning in the entire experience of life, which is going to play a foundational role in everything that we talk about today, and is certainly at the foundation of why I'm building what I'm building and the very deep importance of it. But that isolation in the beginning really was the impetus for a lot of the ways that I became shaped that are different than the way that most people become shaped. I hyper-developed empathy as a result of that isolation, I think in a similar way as when you lose when you lose sight, your brain will start changing to hyper-develop some of the other neural pathways of the other senses, so they become very acute. That definitely happened to me. So I can feel people's feelings streaming from their body in a similar way. The closest I can compare it to is it feels like music to me. So in that way that you kind of feel music, I can feel people's feelings, and you can actually learn a lot about people and what they're really meaning underneath the words that they're saying by paying attention to that. So that was one thing that shaped me. And the other was because I didn't participate in a lot of human connective circuits as a child, I observed them. So I was kind of like a boy in a bubble watching these things happen. And as a result of that, I developed an unusual analytical, mechanistic understanding of the bonding process that is not very well understood commonly, and is largely missing from systems design and systems thinking in the larger world, in the commercial system. and very notably from most technology. And that's kind of what brought me into this space, is having having studied that for many, many years. I really started to see the importance and the potential, danger of that kind of a focus not being in these technological systems that just scale so fast, so easily, so cheaply, and just have sweeping ramifications. I don't know how many of you saw the TikTok kind of conversations that the Senate was having. Was it last year or something like that? But just listening to the politicians try to understand what TikTok even was, and what it could be doing, just made me think, wow, the people who are really making the policy decisions on a day-to-day basis that are actually impacting us are not really the politicians right now. It's the tech bros. For better or worse, it's people. 5 guys in a room can make a decision that impacts billions of people instantly. That's quite a lot sharper of a power than most politicians have right now. So I know I kind of strayed a bit there,
Oh,
but
no, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to point that out. I mean, I feel the same way, and it seems like Silicon Valley, to a large extent, has surpassed the government in terms of influence and power and decision making, and I think that's a problem, or it's a challenge. Do you want to say a little bit about what you're working on, what your company's doing?
yeah. So to give you a little bit of a context of how I ended up here, in my 20s, I became a photographer, and the reason for that, it was the only socially acceptable way to stare at people. I literally had no people skills at all, none. I used to pray every night, dear God, please send me a best friend. Like, that was my prayer constantly, but we moved constantly. I grew up in a car mostly. I remember the car much better than I remember any place we ever lived. It's a 1978 maroon hatchback AMC Spirit with an orange stripe on it. They don't even make those things anymore, of course. That's the thing I remember most when I think of home. So we were always on the move, didn't have the people skills. When I found out about the camera, I lost it. It was amazing. I could look at people, but at the same time I was hidden. And I got invited into the center of the only real social rituals we have left in the West, which are like weddings and funerals and parties. And during those 3 places, there tends to be a lot of alcohol flying around, which means there's a lot of feelings flying around. And because I feel things so strongly, it was just like amazing to be invited into these spaces and to watch all this happen. But I saw something that ended up being really foundational for the whole rest of my life, even to the work I'm doing now, which is photography is strange because the goal ostensibly is to capture who you are. That's kind of like what the point is. But if somebody points a camera at you, it's very likely you become worse at showing us who you are in that moment than you are at any other time during the day. And that's a weird problem to have. Because I feel emotions so strongly, it just bothered me more than I think it bothered most photographers, because when somebody is being themselves, there's a whole stream of data that's flowing from them that our bodies are very, very sensitive to. Most people don't pay attention to it, but your subconscious processes are noticing it, whether you consciously do or not. I notice those things more consciously than most people, as I said before, because of my sensitivity to it. So when you're being yourself, there's like this music flowing from you. And when you do this face, let's just say the music dies instantly, and that feeling it bothered me. And so I wanted to try to find a way around that, and I did, but most of the great photographers in the world find a way around it. What I was able to do, because of my unusual life experience, I was able to explain how and why. So I built a system that has now been used by over 100 million people that basically draws out authentic emotion instantly from people when you're photographing them. And that had a very strong business use case. So it made me enough money to basically be able to spend the last 20 years deeply studying how human connective circuits form between bodies and all of the ramifications of that, of which there are so many. Friendship, which is arguably the most beautiful thing our species is capable of, an astonishing gift that I think we really take for granted, is a part of that. Mentorship, easily, as beautiful as friendship in a different way. It actually is a form of the friendship, and it uses the same biological processes between there. Those things, really are the wealth of our species. This human connective circuit that we're able to do. I saw such profound things happen in these connective circuits when they would form. They would form instantly, and tons of emotion would come out. And I wish we could show you what that looked like, because it's quite beautiful to see. And but I got to see it tens of thousands of times, and I just became obsessed with it. And I realized, if those connective circuits are that easy to form, and if what comes through them is so much more interesting than this, then a lot of society is kind of built wrong, let's just say, because if we're honest with each other, most interactions fall more into fake smile versions of interactions than really deep, meaningful. And I got really obsessed with, what's the difference? How come some conversations you walk away from completely changed? And how come most conversations you walk away feeling like, I wish I could get my 20 minutes back? And why are there so many more of the second ones than the first? There's so many more. And, I could talk so much longer about all of that and why and what I learned, but the short story is AI is not really a thing. It's a very fancy box. And what really matters is what goes into that box. The hard fact is that a lot of the data that went into that box to conceive of the thing that most people refer to when they say AI has a lot of this level of information in it. And that is not only not good because that data is thin, it's really not good because that data is going to increasingly start to shape us. And when you are in the presence of somebody who's doing this to you, it is very difficult to access the best parts of you, because humans mirror each other very strongly. We don't even mean to. It's just a very natural thing. If I had to describe humans in one sentence, having obsessively studied them for the last 30 years, I would say humans are a response to their environment. And it's very, very important to understand that. And you can simply get into that by looking at who you are when you're with your best friend at a dinner, having fun, and who you are when you get a letter from the auditor or whatever. It's a very different version of you, even though theoretically all of the same stuff is right there. One of the biggest misconceptions humans have about themselves is that they are one thing. And that is a ridiculous notion. Like, we are a collective. Like, there's just no way around it. We're made of trillions of things, not even just a few. We're made of so many things we can't even conceive of how many things that we're made of. And then we, take that grand, massive collection of trillions of things, and we're like, oh, that's Peter. And it's like, kind of. I mean, that's incredibly a reductive way to think about it. And that's the same thing that we're doing with AI. It's like, oh, humans, yeah. What data goes into AI, how it's sourced, is incredibly important to me, because it's, of course, going to dictate the quality of that thing. But even more importantly to me, I got into tech specifically about 2 years ago, when I realized I've been studying my whole life how to create environments to which the body naturally responds by going into deep, meaningful, creative, connective modes, which is the best part of being human. And I have a lot of expertise around that, and creating what I call micro-environments to which the body naturally responds by entering those connective circuits. And I realized social media was the largest environment that had ever been built. There's more than 4 billion people every single day who are responding subconsciously to that environment, and it was not built to draw out the best part of us. It was very arguably built to enslave and exploit en masse, and it has done an incredibly good job at that. And I realized that social media will be more pervasive than AI will be more pervasive, more subtle than social technology was, and therefore it has far more ability to do harm or to do good. And it really, really matters that we build AI in a way that it is designed to draw out the best of us. And that's when I realized that though I never would have imagined myself in the tech space, I do believe I've been training my entire life to be here right at this moment in history, to make sure that all of these strange things that I've learned, how humans grow and how we connect, can be a part of the shaping of this very, very important technology in this moment in history.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You can see why I wanted to talk to Jesh, because his ideas, I think, are potentially revolutionary. If we can get them to catch on, and I think they will. Yeah, that's so true, and I think a lot about social media too, and the harm that it's caused. And speaking of the government, the government's failure to regulate that and to really do anything about it. And yeah, it just feels like the ethos that's been driving technology innovation until now has been, very sort of like advertising driven, very sort of like lowest common denominator, like appealing to our kind of basest instincts, and not really designed to evolve humanity and to uplift people and all that. So that's why I think it's so important to have people working on technology that have this mindset. So maybe you can say more about how you see AI and what it can do to how it can be more of an uplifting, kind of elevating force in the world. Do you have thoughts on that?
Oh God. Yes. A couple things spring to mind. I mean, again, these are subjects I've been obsessively exploring for my whole life, and more specifically in this space for the last 2 years. There was a term I learned about 2 years ago called stealth, like being in stealth. I realized when I heard that term, I laughed a little bit, because I was like, I've been in stealth my whole life. Two things come to mind immediately. One is, there's a saying in tech that I've heard more recently, which the ethos is move fast and break things.
Facebook invented that phrase.
Okay. As someone who studies like how relationships grow, that's one of the most horrible things I've ever heard in my entire life. Imagine you start dating somebody and, you're across the table from them and they say, you know what I'm really feeling we should do? Let's move fast and break things. I feel like your interest in that particular relationship, would probably diminish, let's say. And I do think it is a strange thing how we've objectified technology and somehow made it as a separate thing from us. Technology is an extension from us. It's a direct extension from our will, from our choices that we make. And I think it's dangerous to separate technology from ourselves conceptually. It does come from us. We are the ones, therefore, responsible for it. And if technology is a separate thing, like the wind, that we can't really do anything about, then when technology isn't going the right way, we're like, well, it's technology. It's like, no, technology is us. We have to take responsibility for that. And I do think there is a lot of fear in the world around tech. I mean, you look at almost all of the movies about technology, and I don't watch a lot of TV, but in terms of what I'm building, I would probably have heard 100 times, have you seen Black Mirror? Have you seen Black Mirror? And I purposely at this point have not, because I don't want to know whatever it is, that everybody keeps talking about on there. And, all the movies where AI ends up, telling the other robots to kill us and stuff. There's a lot of fear around that. And I think the fear is justified in a certain way. But if fear just stays fear, then nothing ever changes. And I think fear is an indicator, a very beautiful indicator that something needs our attention. But if we have fear about something and then we just hide, or we go the other way, or we fight, flight, freeze, or any of these other things, the source of the fear is never going to change. So a big part of what we're building, if I had to say it simply, we have a vision for the future of machine learning that we refer to as a collective brilliance. So instead of an artificial intelligence, we are building a collective brilliance. The current AI, the way that it's been built, and you can confirm this by asking ChatGPT, has been built from less than 1% of all human data. And that is far too thin. It's far too thin of a percentage of anything to somehow represent everything. And as much as I respect Mr. Musk for many of his different achievements, he said something on January 8th, which is one of the most ridiculous things that I've ever heard in my entire life. He said, in an interview, he said, we have now, I think he said, captured or consumed, the sum of all human knowledge. And he was talking about it in reference to training. And Sutskever said something similar in November. And I think both of them, the context of that, to be fair, was to say that synthetic data is the way forward. Synthetic data is obviously way cheaper. But let's take this back to a relationship, because everything comes back to a relationship. You're across the table from this person that you start dating, and they say, you know, some of what I've told you is about me is real. From here on out, it's going to be synthetic data. How would you feel about that? And my guess is your interest in that particular relationship will diminish. And we have a very, very big danger here, and that is that most of us already feel far from technology. I study this inside and out every single day, and yet most of what the brilliant engineers on my team talk about goes completely over my head. And this is how I spend, my time in my day. The further and further that we allow technology to get away from us, the easier and easier it's going to be for us to just kind of dust our hands off and say, well, it's the politician's job. Look at how that's worked out for us. Well, it's the tech company's job. Look at how that has worked out for us. And so the message really at its core of the whole company that we're building, which is called Ours, and I'll explain why we call it that. You, sitting here in this room, have personal responsibility for how technology ends up being shaped. And that might be an uncomfortable thing to hear, and it might be a scary thing to hear, and yet it does not diminish the core fact of that statement. Every single person in the world, especially, adults, have a responsibility for how this thing is being shaped. And there's not nearly enough understanding of that. And guess who benefits from that the most? The 5 white guys in San Francisco who own AI right now and will continue to own it if that continues to go that way. And I have nothing against white guys. I mean, I present that way myself, but I will tell you, there's an incredible amount of diverse genius in the world, of other perspectives, diverse of all kinds, that needs to be in the thing that's about to shape our children, let alone us. If you think, we should be concerned about what AI is going to do to us, how much more so those who will grow up into a world never knowing anything else but this environment that, they're responding to. How many of us, came up in our environments and started questioning all the traditions and cultures that we had? Any of you as a 5-year-old look at the Christmas tree and be like, why an evergreen? This should have been a deciduous tree. Like, we don't question those kinds of things, and neither will they question this. So the difference between the collective brilliance and the artificial intelligence is deep, and I could talk about it for a long time, but the short version is this data set is way too thin. Last year, as much as 60% of the training of these models came from synthetic data. And most people don't know that, and most people don't even really know what that means. But to give you a really clear example of that, let's say I take a boy from a really rich, deep culture, like let's just say Saudi Arabia. Okay, I take a 3-year-old boy from Saudi Arabia, and I say, explain to me what it means to be a Saudi citizen. He'll be able to say maybe some things to some degree, and then say, okay, now make up the rest. You ask him to make up the rest. How good is he going to be able to do? Not. That's the simple answer, not. Synthetic data has some uses. I'm not putting it down. But to depend upon that, to come up with everything else that is not yet there, it's a massive, massive mistake.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to this like almost blind faith in data. Like we live in this age of big data, right? That's been around for 20 years. Ever since Chris Anderson, I think the founder of Voyager magazine, or the editor-in-chief, he wrote this famous piece, the end of science, I think, and it was about how we can stop doing fundamental science because we can just throw algorithms at data. And it's this like blind faith in Silicon Valley about how data will just like solve all of our problems, and that's kind of what you're speaking to. And yeah, again, like people have pointed this out, that the data they have access to is just for the most part language, and in some cases images, that comes from like a very sort of like specific part of society, that the sort of like northern kind of Western hemisphere kind of educated elite kind of data, and I think there's a lot missing there, obviously, as Jesh is pointing out. And I love what Jesh is saying too, because it's sort of channeling or amplifying the perspective of somebody like Marshall McLuhan. I don't know if anybody knows who that is, but he was a media critic in the 60s primarily, who talked a lot about how technology is something that we create that then shapes us in turn, and so it's this feedback loop. And I think earlier Josh was speaking to what philosophers of technology call reverse adaptation, which is where the way we create technology will then cause us to change our behavior, and I think that's really toxic and dangerous potentially. And so there's this narrative that Josh was referring to, that in Silicon Valley, that if we just let technology do its thing, almost as if it's like a inexorable force that we have no control over, then somehow good things will happen. And I think that's so naive, and so it reminds me that a lot of what I think Josh is speaking to is that I feel we are at this sort of apotheosis or absurd sort of endpoint of this project that we've been at for the past 200 or 300 years in kind of European Enlightenment culture, which is overemphasizing cognitive intellect at the expense of every other human faculty and quality. And I think the narrative coming out of Silicon Valley is so much overemphasizing this very sliver, this tiny sliver of what it is to be human, this intellectual capacity, and we're trying to recreate that using terrible data, 1% of the what it is to be human and conscious. So anyways, I just love that perspective, and yeah, I mean, I